that we have a tendency really to, I've been using the word atomize a lot, but as an atom, a small, anyway. So atomize meaning to break it up into little pieces. We have this tendency in church to really atomize the text. We treat it as a collection of verses rather than a whole book or whole letter, whole unit. And when we do that, we miss a lot of the meaning, because meaning comes through not in just words, not in just sentences. Meaning is developed through argument, through paragraphs over the course of an entire book or letter or sermon or what have you. And so today I want to, as we've done with other books, to just talk about James as a whole, give you some background on James, and talk about some of the recurring themes in the book of James that kind of tie it together. Because one of the beautiful things, I think, it makes it a little challenging at times, but I think it's still a beautiful thing on these biblical books, is that when we can go section by section, talk about individual topics, but there are nuances to the book. There's just a few mentions of a few things in here that really are at the foundation of everything that he says. Every individual issue, every individual rebuke, every individual encouragement is tied back to these two things, I believe, for the book of James. And they're only mentioned a couple of times in the book. Okay? So we'll get to that. First of all, James, let's talk about his name, because this is fun. You know that Joshua and Jesus are the same names, right? And it's pretty clear how Joshua got to Jesus. Yesu was a Yeshua, and then this anglicization, is that the word? Get to Jesus. But for James, his Greek name, or actually we have adopted this name, James, and James has become very popular in England, so we stick with it rather than changing it to the book of Jacob. Okay? But so this is a weird and winding history, but just to give you the brief association here, you have I started with the Greek and then I changed it, but anyway, so if there's something like that. But Jacobos, so this is I, would be an I, but in a lot of English, Western European languages, Germanic languages, that's changed to a J. So you have Yahweh, YHWH, is changed to Jehovah. Okay, so we see that quite a bit. Yesu is Jesus. So I becomes J. So what happened here in the Latin and through the French, eventually, this is called the labial because it's pronounced with the lips. M is also a labial. So this hard labial becomes softened, and so now all of a sudden you have Jakoma or OS, something like that. Iacomos. And then from the French to the Greek, this kind of dropped out. And now you see Yamos, James. Okay. A little weird, but that's how it happened. Okay? So James is Jacob. It's never going to be on a Bible trivia quiz, but now you know something that many people don't. Okay? Welcome. Hey. Just about to report you to the elder.
Probably should anyways.
Yeah. Hey, elder. So this is James. This is often considered to be James, the brother of Jesus, as the writer of this letter. Now you do know that there was an apostle or a disciple of Jesus whose name was James, or Jacob. So you have Peter, James, and John. But that James, something happened to him very early in the Christian church. What happened to James the disciple, or James the apostle? He was martyred, right? He was one of the first Christian martyrs after Stephen, that Herod had him killed. Okay? You can read about that in the book of Acts. According to tradition and history, the works that we have, the early Christian works that we have, James, the brother of Jesus, son of Joseph and Mary, later became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And this James is the one that traditionally is taken as or the epistle of James. Okay? James is often referred to as New Testament wisdom literature. That implies that there's Old Testament wisdom literature. Does anybody know what books in the Old Testament are considered wisdom literature?
Proverbs.
Yes, we do. Right. It's very the poetic books we think of. So Psalms through Ecclesiastes. So there's poetic books right in the middle, with the exception of Song of Solomon. And typically, this wisdom literature talks about has very similar. And I should correct myself. Psalms is not all wisdom literature. There are some wisdom psalms. Some of the psalms aren't really categorized in there. But one of the characteristics of what is typically thought of as wisdom literature is that it focuses on two paths or two ways of living. There is a way of wisdom and a way of folly. There's a way of life and there is a way of death. You can walk on one of these two paths. And so James has a lot of this duality kind of emphasis, that there are two ways that you can live. You can do this thing or you can do this thing. He talks about the wisdom that is from above and the wisdom that is from below, for example. So he gets a lot of talk about being a wisdom type of a genre for the New Testament. But something else that is unique about James in the New Testament is he seems probably close to like 1 Peter. He seems to be very familiar with the Gospels as we have them in the New Testament. Okay, he, especially the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he has some phrases in here that pick up almost verbatim the words that Jesus says. And this is interesting. I mean, how did he get that? Did he read one of the Gospels? Did he early before the crucifixion? We don't think before the crucifixion he was converted. He and his brothers actually kind of mocked Jesus in his claim to be Messiah, but he somehow became familiar with that. Whether he was in the background listening to his brother teach, whether he became familiar with the tradition later or read even the material later, he evidences awareness of material in the Gospels, especially the Sermon on the Mount. James, if this is the brother of Jesus, as I briefly mentioned, did not believe in his brother as a prophet or Messiah, typically during the life of Jesus. But according to tradition, it is after the resurrection that he came to be a believer. He was converted and then became leader of the church. And so as this man, this Jacob, who has a very Hebrew name, a very Jewish name, going back to the patriarch Jacob, this is also a very Jewish book. Probably one of the most, if we can say that, one of the most Jewish letters in the New Testament. And for this reason, it has some very different emphases, some very different tones than what you might get from, say, Paul. Paul was writing primarily to Gentile audiences. James was targeting primarily Jewish audiences. And so there's very little talk about, surprisingly, Jesus. He's mentioned a few times in the book, but there's no talk about the big topics that Paul likes to talk about. There's no mention of really no discussion of the crucifixion and the resurrection. There's no discussion about the person, the deity, the humanity of Jesus Christ. There's very little talk there is, I would say, no talk in the Pauline sense of the concept of justification by faith. There's some discussion of faith, but it's not the same angle that we find in the Pauline literature, I would say even in Peter and John. So James is very different, and for this reason, it's got him into trouble, if we can say that, in the history of the church when we're talking about what books go in the Bible specifically. So one of the names that pops up usually right at the front is Martin Luther, who translated the Bible from Greek into the German language, and he really did not want to include James in the canon. He did not want to include James in the New Testament. He called it in English translation, a right strawy epistle. That's how I've seen it referred to as, or an epistle of straw, made out of straw. He thought it was very much contradictory to what Paul taught. Again, especially justification by faith. That was Luther's big thing. And because James actually has this phrase in here that is seems to be exactly contradictory to what Paul says in Romans, where Paul says in Romans, a man is not justified by works of the law, but by faith. Okay? But because by works of the law, no one will be justified. And yet we read in James chapter 2, that he says in, what's that?
Oh, faith without works is dead.
Yeah. In verse 24, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So he seems to be on the same point, just saying exactly opposite of what Paul had said. I will argue that he's not saying the opposite of what Paul has said because of a little qualifier that Paul uses, and we've actually talked about this before. Because does Paul say man is not justified by works? He says he's not justified by works of law. Okay, there's that qualifier of law. So that's one issue. Another issue is what does the word justify mean in context? And we'll talk about that when we get there. But I think that Paul and James have two very different concepts, two different ideas in mind. We'll also, when we get there, talk about Paul's use of the phrase in Galatians, and he says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision count for anything, but faith working through love. Okay? So there is a kind of work that does count, that does work, and there is a kind of work that doesn't. And that's the distinction that we'll get to. And I think at the core of that, it is because, again, James is addressing a different audience from a different perspective and entrenched in a very specific tradition. Okay? So, with that in mind, it's just kind of background about the author, about the audience. I want to talk about two major points that I think underlie this whole thing, and then just go through the book, all of each of the chapters, and just pull out some sections and show you how these are highlighted here. I had a professor who once said that he believes James is a commentary on the double love commandment. By double love commandment, I mean that. Okay, so you should know these verses. We just talked quite extensively over the course of many weeks about this one over here, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, all your soul, with all your might. Mark throws me off because he adds another one: heart, soul, mind, and strength. So, all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And Jesus says this is the first and greatest commandment. And then we have over here, usually just Leviticus 19:18b, but I wanted to get the whole verse because, you know, if those verse numbers were good enough for Moses, they're good enough for me. So, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And so, when the scribes, they come to Jesus and they say, Teacher, what is the greatest law? What's the most important law? And Jesus tells them this one, first and greatest, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And these two laws, they come forward quite a bit. And Jesus wasn't just making up something new. He was, again, speaking from a tradition, speaking from his history. And so we see, especially this one, interestingly enough, pop up in Paul several times. When he says, for example, that the whole law is summarized in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Because if you love your neighbor as yourself, you won't be committing murder, you won't be committing adultery, you won't be stealing, and so on and so forth. And so I think in James, I think my professor was right, and the more I read this, the more I see this, But James, underlying everything he says here is this question of, do you love God this way? And do you love your neighbor this way? And his argument really is going to come at it from two angles. First is how you associate with God identifies whether or not you really love him this way. And second of all, how you associate with your neighbor that exposes that you're really not loving them as yourself affects how you are loving God. So where the explicit places are, if we can call them explicit. First of all, we see in chapter 2, verse 5. Listen, my beloved brothers, has God not chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him? To those who love God. This is not those who believe in Jesus, or those who have accepted Christ, or those who are in Christ, or those in whom Christ dwells, or the Spirit of God dwells. I mean, all those Pauline phrases that we're very familiar with, but to those who love God. This is, and you may say, well, that doesn't really go back to this commandment. It's not very explicit. I think it is. I think it's more of an implicit thing here. I mean, loving God is important all the way around. But when we put it together with some other things, I think it becomes a little bit more clear. Go down a little bit further in chapter 2. In verse 18, he begins by saying, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. And then here's verse 19. You believe that God is one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Okay? Those are the 2 points in James where this comes through. Okay? On the other law, we see, going back to where'd it go? I can't find the first one. Anyway, 2:8 is the second one. If you really fulfill the royal law, according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You are doing well. Okay? So that one makes it very clear and very explicit that he's got this in mind. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But earlier in that chapter, he says, he talks about the law of liberty. Where'd it go? 125. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. So really should have done that the other way around. But he talks about this law, the perfect law, the law of liberty, and then you say, well, what is that? And then he clarifies that in verse 8 of chapter 2, the royal law, love your neighbor as yourself. This is a law that is perfect. It's a law that is royal. It's a law that sets at liberty. It is that law to love your neighbor as yourself. And these 2 things are connected by this phrase at the end of verse 8. He says, if you fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You are doing well. And then in chapter 2, verse 19, you believe that God is one, you do well. Okay? That's good. Both of those things are good. And so these, I think, are underlying everything he's going to say in this book. Because he's writing to Jews who are going to uphold these 2 laws and say, these are what we're about. This is what our lives are about. And he's writing to Jewish Christians, I should say, converted Jews, Jews who have accepted Christ as the Messiah. They're saying, yes, we emphasize we love God and we love our neighbor. He says, wonderful, you're doing well. And then the whole book is about tearing down their concepts of what that looks like. of showing them in places, showing them of places where they are failing to do that. They are failing to love God, and they're failing to love their neighbor. And he does that primarily by focusing, I think, on this word here. Okay. Think back with me to Deuteronomy many weeks ago, many moons ago. I think it was a year ago, was it? Maybe 11 months and 3 weeks ago. To Deuteronomy chapter 6, when we talked about this passage. Do you remember what we discussed about this concept? What does it mean that the Lord our God, the Lord is one? So there's a few options here, a few positions that are argued. One of them is, this is a monotheism. And I said, well, that's true. I don't of this passage.
One purpose and one mind.
One purpose, one mind. Yeah, that is correct. How else would you say that? One purpose, one mind concerning what?
His holiness and his justification.
Holiness and justification, okay. His character, okay, he's one of the character.
Single essence.
Single essence, okay. Yep. Unity. So yeah, I mean, there's this oneness in God himself, but remember when we talked about Deuteronomy, this is a book about what? Big C word. Covenant. Okay, so how is he one with regard to covenant? This goes back to the purpose statement.
He's faithful in his covenant to us, even though we're not faithful to him.
Yeah, so he's absolutely loyal.
There's no deviation.
There's no deviation in him. He has one object of his affection, and one object of his one people with whom he is in covenant, and he is entirely devoted to them. Singleness of purpose, singleness of devotion, okay? And he does not divide that between Israel and Edom or whoever else. Okay? We talked about the law as this concept of being one. We see this in James. We'll mention it here in a minute, but this idea that you can't keep the law. Say you're keeping the law if you just commit adultery. I'm keeping everything except for just adultery. This is the point with Jesus when the young man says, "What must I do to be saved?" And Jesus lists all the things, and he gets them on covetousness. Right? And that exposes him as a lawbreaker. Because the law is a whole. It's like a fine piece of china. If you chip it, it's broken. It's an all or nothing type of commitment. Okay? And so what James does here from the very beginning, he sets up this concept of oneness over against the concept of division or dividedness. And this is at the heart of James's epistle. So look at it here at the beginning. He says, actually in verse 5, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him." Does anybody else say anything besides reproach there, without reproach?
Without finding fault.
Without finding fault, okay? Does anybody have a study Bible that might have any comments on that?
Does not reproach.
Does not reproach?
Criticizing those who ask.
Without criticizing? Okay.
That was in the notes.
Okay. Well, this word here, I think that's good translation, without reproach, without criticism, but something that we miss in translation is nuances of words or double entendres, where a word has, kind of slips over into this category of meaning as well, and kind of hints at something else going on there. So this word here that is used for reproach is a word that indicates someone who is of pure intent. This single intent. It's a picture of oneness. It's a word that has to do with wholeness. A complete willingness on God's part to give to those who ask Him. So here he is at the beginning, setting up God's character. God is one whose character is without division. It is undivided in His intent. He does not, here's the picture, He is not one who gives with one hand and slaps with the other. Okay? That's what the picture is. If someone with approach, it's someone who gives something with one hand and does something to hurt with the other hand. And you hear the spy stories, you're walking by somebody who just slipped their knife in. God does not do that. He does not give with an ulterior motive to punish or to harm or to hurt. God has a singleness of purpose in His giving, a singleness of focus. And so when you ask, if you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. There's a picture of the oneness. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. The one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. You see the division? Some of it you see clearly, some of it you don't see yet, but I'll show you. Okay? So we have division here. He is a man who is driven and tossed by the waves. First he's thrown this way, and then he's thrown that way.
Without rudder.
He's maybe thrown this way and that way and this way and that way. I mean, he's thrown all over the place by the winds and by the waves. He's driven and tossed with not a single focus on the compass. Okay? He's also a double-minded man. What is double-minded?
I think of unresolved.
Okay? Unresolved? Torn?
Understands something intellectually but doesn't do it.
Okay. Interestingly here, this word in the Greek, it doesn't use the word mind. It uses the word that we often translate as soul. It's a double psyche, double psyche.
Bipolar disorder?
He's a bipolar man. Yeah, I mean, if you want. I guess you could put it that way. I mean, one moment he's all about this over here, but then the next moment he's all about this over here. That's completely contrary to this. He says, in this moment right now, I'm completely devoted to this thing. This is what I want from you. And then he turns away from this prayer, and he's over here pursuing this thing that is exactly opposite of what he's been fully committed to in prayer here.
So, when I was reading through James, I got to this, but let him ask in faith with no doubting.
Mm-hmm.
And then I looked at my life and went, well, my life is full of doubting.
Okay.
Is this word no doubting sort of tied into this being tossed about and double?
I'm glad you asked.
Thank you.
Glad you asked. So what does it mean? What do you think of when you think no doubting? I mean, what does that mean to you? Does it mean the word of faith movement where you have to just be absolutely confident that you're going to get what you ask for?
Well, it's about trusting. I mean, we talk about faith and trusting God.
Yeah.
So the opposite would be doubting God?
Wouldn't it be like
It's every one of us.
trusting that God can and will do what He's promised?
Yep.
But at the same time, like, your will is not always in line with His will, so what you ask might not be in His will, but His will is always going to be what's best for you.
Yeah. I don't want to give any kind of special meaning and tell you that doubting doesn't mean doubting. It means doubting. And I think here it doesn't mean that you can just confidently claim anything you pray for. There's something very specific here that we're told to ask for.
Right, I was like, this isn't a generalized doubting in any circumstances.
It's
in
not a
regard to
blank
God
check.
giving wisdom.
Right. So, God gives wisdom to everyone who asks, without reproach, generously. And so can you ask for wisdom and expect to get it?
So define Christian
Yes.
wisdom.
You can. Wow, that, I don't know, that's gonna be a whole different thing. I feel like that's kind of you're setting a booby trap for me there or something. Okay, so when God makes a promise, you can ask and know that He's gonna give it. So how many times, so the idea here is one who continues, and then I'm getting into the lesson on this verse, so I don't want to refrain myself. But when you ask for wisdom, receive it. Be single-minded about it. God has promised. Ask Him for wisdom and claim it. That God, not because you have to claim it from His hand in the sense that He doesn't really want to give it to you and you're just going to snatch it. You ask and you know that He's going to put it in your hands. That's without doubt. Purpose coming. Okay, but what I want to get at here is that this is another one of those words that carries with it connotations that we miss. Okay? So the word here is, if I spell it right, okay, diakrinos or diakrino. Probably diakrinos.
That's spelled
Without
wrong.
division. There you go. How is your Greek? Okay.
Greek to me.
So D-I-A-K, or we could put C-H-R-O-N-O-S, or just like an O with a long, okay? Whether it's a verb or an, okay? So this diakrino, this is the word used for judging. For doubting here. And it is, this is this is an I, not an O, sorry. See what happens when I try to write it in English? I can't do it. This is the word to judge. This is the word to judge, and this is a prefix meaning through, or it's could be, it's implying your division. This is two judgments, or a divided judgment kind of thing. Your doubt is a divided judgment. And in this sense, it's a divided judgment about God. Will He, won't He? Will He give it, will He not give it?
Is He good or is He bad?
Okay? Is He good or is He bad? Is He gonna, give it with one hand and stick me with the other? Kind of thing. So it's this divided judgment about God. And so here in these verses, in some of these opening verses, James sets up for the first time this distinction between God, who is one, singleness of purpose, singleness of intent, and man who comes to him with a divided heart, a divided mind, a double-mindedness, tossed to and fro, back and forth, not sure whether he really wants this thing that he's asking for God, or whether, God will give it or not. And he says that kind of person, who is divided back and forth, should not expect to receive anything from God. God does promise freely, and He does give what He promises to those who will come to Him in oneness, in singleness. Okay? Look down now at let's see, verse 16 of chapter 1. He says, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change." Okay? A statement of God's oneness. The shadow due to change, the changing position of the sun makes the shadow move. This is kind of even though there's more order to it, it's this picture of this back and forth kind of movement. It's not steady, it's not stable, it's not stationary. Okay? It's not one. And that's not God. He is the Father of lights. Meaning, there is no light greater than Him that causes Him to cast the shadow. There is no changing light in the sky like the sun changes in the sky and changes the shadow. There is no sun about him that causes his shadow, or actually casts any shadow, and causes a shadow on him to change. He is constant. He is one. He says here, later on down, look at verse 22. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. There's the duality. If you hear the word and you read the word and then you don't do the word, it's like a man who builds his house on the sand. That's a dual-natured person. He ought to be doing what he's hearing, but he doesn't. He says, for if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror, for he looks at himself and then goes away and at once forget what he was like. There's this duality. You see what you are in the mirror. You see what you're like. You ought to know what you're like. You ought to know what your appearance looks like. But you go away and you forget. There's this split in your personality. There's this split in your understanding or perception of what you look like, of who you are. And this is, I think, a contrast to the way God does not cast shadows. He does not change. You don't even remember what your face looks like. There's this change. Go to chapter 2. My brothers, show no partiality as you hold faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. This partiality is making distinctions. It is not distinction within yourself, but it is distinctions among yourselves. Okay? So he says, if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears a fine clothing, and you say, sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down at your feet, have you not then made distinctions among yourself, and become judges with evil thoughts? Remember what I said about this word? Guess what word is used for distinction and judges? Have you not made distinctions among yourselves? Have you not become judges with evil thoughts? Have you not created division in the community among yourself, rather than pursuing this oneness in the community, this wholeness among yourselves that reflects who God is in his nature? Look on down to verse 10, or rather verse 9. He says, if you show partiality, creating distinctions there, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. For he who said, do not commit adultery, has also said, do not murder. If you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. For judgment, division, is without mercy to those who have shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Do you see there the oneness of God in that picture, reflected in the oneness of the law? Okay. There's division with you because you're showing partiality. You're becoming judges, creating division in the community, and by doing that, you're breaking the law, which cannot be divided. It is one law, and if you break one law, you break the whole law. And it is one law because God, who gave the law, is one. He who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not commit murder. The oneness of the law is grounded in the oneness of God. We already talked about chapter 2, verse 19, this, you believe that God is one and you shudder. We can go down to, and we can go all through this thing, but let me try to find just a few more. Look at chapter 4. Let's just start in verse 1. He says, "What causes quarrels, and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you?" Picture of inner division? Yes. Okay. "You desire and you do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You ask and do not receive, because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions." So here he's talking about these divisions among the community. Someone has what you want, you can't have it, so you murder them. Or you fight and you quarrel. And then this division within you. You ask for something, this is a picture of chapter 1 too. You ask for something, but you don't ask rightly. You ask it from God, to glorify God, presumably, but you ask it rather than glorify Him to gratify your own passions and your own desires. That's division. That's not oneness. It's so far does it, go ahead.
Do you think he's talking about literal murder here?
Possibly.
Okay. No, there's no history that we know of.
Not that we know of.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it could be metaphorical too. But, I mean, especially if he is rooted in the Sermon on the Mount as much as I think he is. You've heard it said, "Do not commit murder," but I tell you, if you hate your brother, you've committed murder in your heart. So, but he brings this division to such a point where he calls them adulterous people, adulteresses. And you shouldn't let that slide over. I mean, that's a prophetic pronouncement. The Old Testament the prophets call the people adulterers and adulteresses all the time. But this is this picture of people who claim to be faithful to their spouse and profess love for their spouse, but they treat God like a couple. I mean, they treat Him like a vending machine, where they can put their quarters in, say their prayers, push a button, and get from God what they want, so that they can go around the corner and spend time with their lover. This is a divided heart. A person who is not wholly committed to one partner. A person who is not fully relationship. Know that friendship with the world is enmity with God. Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. They're saying we can do both. And James says, God is one. No, you can't. You can't have and maintain this divided loyalty where God is going to accept your partial commitment to Him and your partial commitment to your worldly passions. He says, no, because I am one, any commitment to the worldly passions means you're an enemy of God. Because God cannot and will not be divided. He demands whole and perfect conformity and commitment to Him. Let's do maybe one more. Bye. Well, maybe that's enough. Anyway, so you get the picture here. I mean, the whole book of James, even though he just doesn't come out and say it explicitly, is about God is one, you do well. Where does that occur? Right smack dab in the middle of you have faith and I have work. Show me your faith by what, okay? It's right smack dab in the middle of it. What's the issue of faith that they're claiming? God is one. Love God, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. That's the issue of faith. James says, wonderful. You love God that way? Show me. In how you love your neighbor. And then he talks about not just these issues of prayer and commitment to God and friendship with the world, which is over here, but he shows them how it plays out in relationships. You pray and do not receive. Why? because you're asked to spend it on your pleasures. Or maybe you don't pray at all. You just go murder somebody and you fight with somebody just to take what they have. Because you want it. And they got it. You say, oh, we love God. We're committed to the God who is one. And yet you're creating divisions in your church. You're creating divisions in your relationships. You're showing preference to people who can benefit you, and you're belittling those who have nothing to offer. Is that what faith is about? It says no. The faith that says, the Lord is one, and I love the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, and mind, is justified by works that show that you love your neighbor. And James, I think, is saying that you cannot divide those two. Just as God is one, these two commandments are one. Just like if you commit adultery and you have not murdered, you've still broken the entire law. If you do not love your neighbor as yourself, then you do not love God in oneness. That's what James is about, and I think you're going to find it challenging. And I think you'll find it a bit discouraging and maybe even depressing at times. But hopefully, above all, you'll find it encouraging, and you will find it refreshing to hear something that I think is badly needed in our lives and in our society, and it's some of the most down-to-earth practical stuff you will find in the New Testament.
I was gonna say, one of the things the way I see the difference between Paul and James is not that they're going against each other, but it's almost more like they're in a battle and they're back to back, fighting different battles. So they're fighting these two different battles. They don't disagree with each other. They're just fighting different battles. So that's how I would view it.
Right.
I thought that was a powerful analogy.
Yep, I like that too. Okay. Comments, questions, snide remarks? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.